Here's a guy who's responsible for the death of thousands of people. He ruled a country into ruin, been on the run for months. And, I find myself face to face having to provide medical care for him. And it kind of goes to the deeper point that you have to stick to the mission. That's what I did when I took care of Saddam Hussein.
Handling pressure is a trait that can define success and survival, especially in the most extreme situations. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Sudip Bose with us, a man who has exemplified this ability throughout his remarkable career. Dr. Bose is a distinguished Army physician who treated Saddam Hussein after his capture, and beyond the battlefield, he's been recognized as one of America's heroes of emergency medicine, served as a professor, and as a sought-after speaker. And now, with his Prime Video series, Desert Doc, viewers can gain even further insight on how to thrive in high-stress environments. Sudip, we're honored to have you here on the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope people are enjoying their walk as they walk a mile, and I can give them some tips, and I look forward to connecting.
Absolutely. Well, as they remember to turn on their Strava app to track that mile that they're walking, I want to talk about your extraordinary career that spanned in high-pressure environments like the battlefield of Iraq that we've both been on, through pivotal moments like 9/11 and the COVID-19 pandemic, to some of the busiest emergency rooms in the nation. What's a strategy that you've relied on to manage the stress and maintain your mental resilience through these intense challenges?
Stress is nothing new. It's been around long before Homo sapiens. What's new is the sensation that we can't cope with it anymore. So we reach for that pill, that cigarette, that bottle of liquor, anything to numb out a world that's too loud and too overwhelming. And, what if there were a better way to do this? And I've thought about this a lot in my experiences. What if instead of trying to dampen the stress response and failing, because stress is a normal bodily reaction that helps human beings survive and thrive, we need stress. What if we actually shifted our mindset to not activate the stress response when we don't need it? And that's what I hope we can discuss today. We're in a world right now that our bodies physiologically, like as a physician, I realize our bodies aren't made for it. Whether you're referring to my experience in the emergency room or on the battlefield or in intense moments, it's what we're all going through. We've gotten to the point where there's just too much of everything, right? Dings, digital connections, notifications, mating choices, global terror, disaster. You turn on the news, it floods you, political division. And this leads to yelling at that person you love, your heart racing, you're drowning in debt from your spending, you're not able to sleep, you have trauma, you have pain, you have looping thoughts, insecurity, you're gaining weight, and relationship struggles. So to answer your question, although, I was in the Army, I think that we all of us have an inner army that helps us fight stress and combat what our body is physiologically trying to do. I'm not going to flood you here with medical like hypothalamic pituitary axis and cortisol and norepinephrine and dopamine and your amygdala and DSM-5. We can wonk out on that, but kind of the greater point is let's keep this inner army strong. And that's physically, mentally, emotionally. So as a physician, there's no way I'm not going to tell you to not sleep properly. I just listened to one of your podcasts recently on someone who was talking about the importance of sleep. And that's very important. And exercise and nutrition, feeding the machine of our body, spending time with loved ones. But let's take it to the next level beyond that, because that's kind of cliche as a physician. So I'm the medical director for Odessa Fire Rescue. And our medical center hospital in Odessa, Texas, where I work as an emergency physician, we are a referral center and cover 38,000 square miles of land. It's the largest geographic coverage by any hospital system in the United States. It's the size of Maine, the whole state of Maine. For Odessa Fire Rescue, when we're called, I have to set up the protocols that they follow in the field as paramedics or when fire goes out. And when they're when the alarm goes off, we don't focus on the alarm. We focus on the actual fire that's causing the alarm, right? So it's similar in our body, whether it's these hormones I mentioned earlier or something triggering that alarm. We often try to stifle that alarm, that bottle of liquor, that pill. So I think some of the methods that we can do that are better are just starting from the basics. Just breathe, right? When you're in this moment, in the heat of the moment, someone's heart stops in front of you, the grenade explodes in your world that is causing stress, and choppers land in your world that are bringing patients amputated at the brink of life and death, bleeding to death. Whatever those bleeders are for you, take a breath, breathe in, twice as long to breathe out. Don't catastrophize it. We tend to do that sometimes, making it worse than it is. And sleeping, exercising, building up before that, preparing in peacetime, sweating in peace so you don't bleed in war, prayer. And then the one I'm going to focus on as we talk about this is using each other as a resource, like brotherhood. And by brotherhood, it's that term we had in the military, you know, Danny. I mean, I mean brotherhood, I mean sisterhood, I mean humanhood, right? Like just using each other and choosing to connect. So those are some of the strategies, I think, at the superficial level, and we can dive deeper into that.
Yeah, I want to kind of talk about maybe some specific key events that occurred. I remember when I was in Iraq and I first became independent duty corpsman, and the show was now mine to run. Like when I was a junior corpsman, it was very stressful, and there was a lot of people around me to support me, especially in those early days. And then when I started to gain a little bit more experience, a little bit more training and put on rank, you end up being in charge. And a lot of the times we're in charge of our own lives and different stressors come up. And I just remember, when you talk about take that moment to take a breath, I remember when the first femur fracture came into my clinic of a local national that I couldn't clearly communicate with. The parents there freaking out. The junior corpsman had never seen anything like this. I had never physically seen anything like this. I only trained for it. I trained off the battlefield so that I could perform on the battlefield. And I remember going in my head, I have no clue if this is actually going to work. I only know I've theoretically done this in training scenarios. And so, we put the traction splint on them, we start cranking it down. And I remember the training teaching me, watch for signs of internal bleeding, watch for signs of pallor and going into shock. But at some point, there's going to be a popping sensation and instant relief in the patient. And I just kept cranking that traction splint, right? Just kept on pulling on that knob. And I have everybody watching me. It was a high pressure situation. And I was like, what if this doesn't work was going on in my head, but on my face, I was just like, we've got this. This is all you have to do. Are there any moments like that where you're just like, hey, I'm able to perform under pressure because I'm relying on the training that I did beforehand to get me here, and like the pressure is manageable?
Sure. I think you nailed it. We learn all this stuff theoretically. We read it in a textbook. We've heard about it. But then when you're actually in the situation, it's very different. And you do have to control your physiology and have plans for not if it fails, but when it fails. And actual expertise is not the lack of failing. It's just knowing what to do if plan A doesn't work, to have a plan B. And that's something we can all do in our own lives, where whatever our biggest stressors are, if you think about it, you don't want to catastrophize, but you want to have plans for what to do next. And, when we're intubating a patient. So intubating is when someone's unconscious and you use a device to stick a tube in their trachea to help them breathe. If they have a difficult airway and you can't get that airway, you have to know what to do next, not at that moment figure out what to do next. And many of us listening have been at the tip of the spear, right? Been in combat. We're veterans. I know your audience is largely veterans and they're fighting their own wars. And I think it's just being able to know the next steps. And then also just being able to inoculate yourself. What do I mean by that? Getting exposed to it, maybe in lesser doses, right? Like we all had our childhood immunizations and our great-great-grandparents might have died from tetanus, or they might have died from diseases that we don't see today, where someone just stiffens up and can't move because of, tetanus or polio, and losing your lungs and limbs because of polio. We get a vaccination, it kind of gives us a lower dose. So if we're exposed to the actual stressor, our body's ready for it. So similarly with whatever that stress is, if we can get ourselves in there, get prepared, think of the following steps, go through that training, and you actually can inoculate yourself, those things won't become stressful anymore. They'll be a lot more manageable. It's always the first time when you're putting on that traction splint, like you mentioned, or you're listening for that popping noise and it doesn't come. That's anxiety, right? So you gotta just prepare.
Speaking of potential anxiety, I know I was 17 years old when I signed my first military contract, and it was a world that I didn't know that I was going to go into, but there was a lot of people around me that were in the service. And so kind of I got an idea of what they were doing. What led you to pursue like such an intense career, especially during those early 2000 years in the Army?
Do we ever predict what's going to happen? You just kind of do your thing, and it ends up sometimes like Forrest Gump, where you just end up in these situations. I mean, I was inspired to join the military because of, I think, my parents mostly. I mean, they came from Calcutta, India in the 1960s, before I was born, and they're looking for somewhere tropical, vibrant, lots of people like Calcutta. So naturally, they land in North Dakota. And they're in the freezing snow. Like my mom's in her sari with open-toed sandals. Like, where the heck am I? And then, that was in North Dakota. And then they moved to Duluth, Minnesota, and then Ann Arbor, Michigan, where my sister and I were born. And then kind of the suburbs of Chicago, where I grew up. And all along growing up, I heard these amazing stories of people who helped my parents adjust to a new nation, get a new winter coat, learn how to eat a hot dog without a spoon and a knife, like just adjusting, and just to help my parents so much. So maybe this inner sense of patriotism and wanting to pay it forward to the people, to the nation that helped my parents. And then, I went through, so there's maybe that element that got me into the military, and then just a sense of adventure maybe all of us had when we joined. And I was very fortunate. I got accepted into this honors program in medical education at Northwestern University, where you get accepted into medical school basically out of high school. So you just kind of whiz through it. I finished high school, I went to college, started med school at 21 and became an MD at 25. And I was just thinking, wow, is this it? I just live in a suburb and take care of patients. So that sense of adventure of let's do something else, let's serve the nation. And then it was a great career move. As a corpsman yourself, like the training in the military, the emergency medicine training is just next level. So it's a good career move. I have my great uncle was a freedom fighter in India. His name is Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And he helped gain independence for India from the British in 1940s. So just kind of all these factors, and signed the dotted line, and then one thing led to another, and it led to what many of our listeners have probably experienced, or their loved ones have experienced.
I love that it was not just a sense of adventure that you were after, but, it was this opportunity to give back to those that you felt had helped your family reach where you were at. And a lot of stuff we know in the military is just kind of a matter of circumstance. You're in the right place or wrong place at the right time, right?
Yeah.
For me, being assigned to a military transition team was a game changer in my life. And I know that you were one of many doctors that happened to provide some form of medical care to the then captured Saddam Hussein after the Iraq invasion. Like, I remember watching that on the news and feeling the gravity of that situation.
It was intense. Yeah.
Yeah. What was that like?
I mean, this whole podcast is about stress, right? So here's a guy who's responsible for the death of thousands of people. He ruled a country into ruin, been on the run for months. And, I find myself face to face having to provide medical care for him. And it kind of goes to the deeper point that you have to stick to the mission, right? It doesn't matter sometimes what you think and what your opinion is. It's prior to this, I was in inner city Chicago, and sometimes my patients were gang members who'd shot the last patient, killed the last patient that I saw. But you have to be able to detach. And I think that's a big part of dealing with stress is you have to not overthink it. Just have that ability to compartmentalize and focus on the duty at hand and get the job done. And I think that's a lot of what's leading to stress with veterans who come back is when we were in it, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, or prior generations, Vietnam, Korean War, there was an element of not thinking about it and just going through and doing your job because you're like, if you think about it, you drive yourself crazy. You're in the middle of the Second Battle of Fallujah. You're in the middle of Najaf. You're in the middle of treating a dictator. You're tying tourniquets on the streets with people fighting or trying to kill you. You can't overthink it. And that's, I think, kind of one of the hacks of dealing with stress. Because when we come back, a lot of veterans get stuck with these looping thoughts in their head that just go back to moments. And it's just being able to compartmentalize, like take that looping thought, brush it off, like the gremlin on your shoulder, and just focus on what you got to do. And that's what I did when I took care of Saddam Hussein.
That's wild. When you're talking about being able to brush it off, I remember when I first started having severe debilitating flashbacks as related to PTSD trauma from a younger sailor serving in Iraq. And it happened during a training evolution. And I started getting really worried because it's not that I was necessarily having the looping thoughts, but I did a really poor job of managing my own stress on the daily. And so it ended up compounding into this full-blown panic attack. And I remember thinking during my transition back, like, I don't sit here and relive Iraq and Afghanistan on a regular basis. And I try my best to compartmentalize, but there were still things that my body would react to that my mind was like, what are you doing, body? Like, this is a dumb thing to do. And, the transition back into civilian life for me took quite a coordinated effort because I still wanted to be operational. I still wanted to go and support the men and women I was serving alongside and fight for our causes, which were generally people related, especially on the medical side. Like, that was one of the things I loved about being in medicine was that I didn't have to pick a side. I just had to treat patients, and I loved treating patients. It was great. And I know that you got to stay kind of in the medical field because you were already a doctor, and a lot of enlisted people were not certified in the civilian sector to do the stuff that we did overseas. So how did you go about as a medical doctor living this desert life and this combat life and transition back into the civilian sector? Because like standards change.
You're right. I mean, it's reintegration is difficult. And you think about it, this is really young people, 18 years old, facing stresses that most human beings may not face in their entire life. Guys, women who are at the tip of the spear, and they're to go back to an ordinary life where you're all of a sudden you come back to the United States and it's neon lights and escalators and the things that are stressful for you can't relate. People will never relate to what you've been through. Will never see what you've been through. They won't understand what you've been through. And what it takes to make it in this world becomes difficult. And it's very different than what it took to make it in combat. That adds to the stress. And I feel like, for me, I did have perhaps an unfair advantage where my job directly correlated back as a physician, as a battalion surgeon in combat. I came back and it made sense that I'm a physician here. But, if you're driving tanks or you're a gunner, it doesn't always correlate, although those leadership skills are there, that resiliency is there. But now it becomes you have to fill out a resume and figure out how to get a job. And you're dealing with people who just don't get it, it feels like. So those become challenging for reintegrating. And I think there are organizations, in different elements that can help. Like I'm on the board of an organization called Bridge My Return, as in a bridge, Bridge My Return. It helps people get jobs, right? And I think a lot of people, it's that loss of purpose when you come back from the military. You had such a purposeful job. You're defending our nation. You're putting your life on the line to do it. It's noble. And then that purpose goes away. It's the same thing I see in firefighters after they retire. It's keeping that purpose. So maybe that organization can help. I think you lose that camaraderie, that brotherhood I was talking about, sisterhood, humanhood, not getting isolated and reaching out. When you come back, it sometimes sucks making friends as an adult, right? It's awkward. It's weird, but we need that connection. It's very important. That's how we are. And, going back to, as Odessa Fire Rescue Medical Director, you recognize the alarm, but it's the fire that's more important. So when you're alone and isolated, your bodies keep score and it recognizes and it sets off alarms. And that might be those stresses, those thoughts, those flashbacks, those hallucinations, the loss of purpose, the loss of brotherhood. Let's deal with the fire that's causing it. Loss of purpose, loss of brotherhood, not try to tampen the alarms. And we want those alarms. It protects us. It's telling us something. And that's a big part of it, is recognizing what your body is trying to tell you, being in tune and getting to the underlying cause.
You've mentioned it a few times that stresses are good. They are key indicators. And a lot of the times we spend a lot of time trying to suppress those key indicators because they feel uncomfortable. If you're walking on, we'll put it in Texas, right, during the summer, if you're walking barefoot on pavement, that stress is telling you you're about to burn your feet. So you have to get off the sidewalk. However, there's some things that, are meant to strengthen us and meant, if we lean into it, can continue to develop us. And I know a lot of officers, a lot of medical professionals in your situation that did have a difficult time transitioning back and finding their way, because everything takes time. And from my experience within the military, everything happens so quickly. Training 2 months, this operation a week here, deployment 6 months, and everything is constantly go, go, go. But when you step into the civilian sector, waiting to hear back about a potential job application, transferring around, you yourself are involved in so many different things. And one of the things that really stands out to me is the resilience of your patience. To let things develop. You're currently working on an amazing Amazon Prime series called Desert Doc that really highlights what's happening in your AO. Like you said, the largest AO in America, the size of Maine, is what you guys have to cover. And it gives us this behind the scenes look into this world of emergency medicine, which, yeah, it happens fast, but it takes a long time to get into there. So kind of given your experience of this fast-paced world of Iraq to, here we are, nearly 20 years later from a key pivotal moment to saying, hey, now I'm doing this other thing to help my community here in Odessa, Texas. What are you hoping to accomplish with Desert Doc, and how do you manage, this waiting game?
Sure. Yeah, no, I'd be honored if you and our listeners watched. It's Desert Doc. It's streaming on Prime Video. And it's interesting. It's created by Emmy award-winning producers. And basically, it's the only show that is actually live emergency room patients. It's not reenacted. It's not dramatized. It's unveiling the curtain on what happens in the emergency room, and it zooms out to experiences in the military, other parts of the world, missionary, everything from, oil field injuries out here to the opioid epidemic to challenging medical situations in our healthcare system. It covers all of that, and it's pretty engaging. So I'd be honored if you guys watched. And when someone comes into the emergency room, it's usually the worst day of their life, and it's stress, and it's a broken down body from either not seeking care or just not having access to care. Our United States healthcare system is a cluster. It's a mess. And it just shows what happens in the emergency room. So that's the show. It's on Prime Video. And going back to your earlier point, I think you're right. Stress, we want stress, right? Think of our ancestors on the campground. You want to react lightly to noises. You want to awake easily to what can eat you. You want to have nightmares and flashbacks to what can kill you. You want to get angry because it predisposes you to fight, or depressed because it pulls you out of circulation for a bit. These are normal. And even our founding fathers, right? There's a reason the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness, it's smart that we call it a pursuit because, 1776, the Declaration of Independence promises happiness. In 1788, Madison wrote about happiness in Federalist 62. In 1835, Tocqueville, he's a French political philosopher, he wrote, Democracy in America, observed that Americans seem unhappy. So whatever the listeners are facing, this goes back to our founding fathers. This goes back to our ancestors on the campground. This is not just you. You're not alone in this. And it's just finding that security is what the founding fathers thought would lead to happiness, just security. So now we're in a world where we're secure. Thankfully, we're not in the combat zone. We're not in Iraq, Afghanistan. You're safe, usually where you live in the United States. But what's happening is, like I said, our bodies aren't made for everything we're being bombarded with. And those same alarms are going off. I'm calling, the hypothalamus pituitary axis, the cortisol, the dopamine, the norepinephrine, all that stuff alarms. But our body's feeling that and it's real. So the solution, I think, is finding purpose and camaraderie, like I mentioned. And social media doesn't count. Technology doesn't count. Social media is not social, right? It isolates you more and your brain doesn't register that technological connection, and it's kind of false friends. And it's got to be the awkwardness of human connection. And I think that breaks into three categories. Intimate connection, someone you're intimate with. Number two, someone to do things with, things you like to do, different people. And the third is some sort of social group where you feel like you belong. And if you look statistically at it, it's difficult because right now there are, for your listeners, just think, I don't want to put statistics out there. That's boring. I'll put everyone to sleep. But how many people are you comfortable just calling in the middle of the night, right? If you look at that, if something happens at 3 a.m., how many people are you comfortable just calling? So it's about 50% don't have a single friend they can call. So me and you are talking here on this podcast. One of us do, one of us don't. And think of that. If you have an anxiety attack, an asthma attack, you slip and fall. So your body still keeps score. Subconsciously, it knows it's isolated and those alarms are going off. How many have close friends? 3 or more close friends. 70% do not have 3 or more close friends. And 8 out of 10 basically say their close friends don't know them deeply. So you're interacting with these people, but they don't know what you're struggling with. So your body's still keeping score. Those alarms are going off. So you got to fight it. You got to just embrace the awkwardness of meeting new people, finding that camaraderie, trying to find those 3 groups of social connections. And subconsciously, that's what's going to happen. Otherwise, your body keeps score, and I hope not, but you might end up in the emergency room with something. If you're lonely, it's higher risk of heart attacks, strokes, cardiovascular disease, addiction, Alzheimer's, dementia, personality disorders. So again, we got to just find the fire. We got to address that. Otherwise, all of us are one step away from being in the emergency room, right? It could happen to any of us. All the people in Desert Dock on the Amazon series didn't expect to be there that day, and they ended up there. So let's sweat in peace so we don't bleed in war. Work on these things. Choosing connection, choosing freedom to get your finances in order and try to not have your alarms go off because you feel stressed by that. Whatever you can do, I think these are things that we can work on to overcome what we're all struggling with in the human condition.
Yeah, that's That's so beautiful. You touched on camaraderie, and I'm going to come back to that in just a moment because you severely downplayed Desert Doc. Like you're just like, if you could check, no, go check it out. Sudeep, you put in so much work in your life to bring this level of expertise to this area of the world, and it's so important that people understand how hard the American medical system is. Because as you were mentioning, we have to deal with emergency medicine. So we have to deal with that life and death situation, those accidental gunshot wounds, those intentional ones, the car accidents, the fires, whatever constitutes a physical emergency. But then when we have 70% of America, as you were talking about, don't have close personal friends, that leads to further isolation, that leads to chronic drug use, that leads to chronic alcoholism, that leads to worsening mental health.
You're trying to dampen those alarms.
Yeah. And so, that level of isolation that veterans experience after the service, because we didn't all join on the same day. And when we show up to boot camp or we show up to OCS or whatever that training organization is, we all arrive at the same, and then we all get sent out to different units. So we never have like this graduating class that we connect with. We all get out at different times, which creates an instant isolation, an instant lack of camaraderie, an instant lack of similar mission and purpose. And it's really hard to then reconnect with that in a new civilian lifestyle. And as you were talking about, like this concept of brotherhood, sisterhood, camaraderie, that relational help of, building your community to help overcome these situations. I know if it wasn't for my community, I would probably be dead at this point. I would have either drinking myself to death or I would have died by my own hands. But it was the people like you mentioned that I was able to call at 3 a.m. and say, hey, like I am not sleeping. I am not well. And it took a long time to get comfortable with that. How do you go about maintaining your relational help and build your community?
I think it's a little bit all the time. You just got to improve 1% every day, right? So we go back to that inner army. It's physical, it's mental, it's emotional, and you got to work on that, right? Like the physical, we have one vehicle to make it through this thing called life. It's our human body. So the physical does matter. Like sleep is a workout. It's the janitor at night that sweeps those cobwebs out of your brain and keeps brain health going. That's part of physical inner army. Exercise, nutrition, keeping that strong in peacetime. Then the mental health is choosing connection and seeing what it is that's triggering those alarms in you and trying to find those 3 categories of connection, right, that we're talking about. And then the mental, emotional army, being able to compartmentalize. When the stress does come, can you compartmentalize? You got a brutal dictator in your face who's probably wants to kill you, but you got to provide him medical care. Can you compartmentalize? Can you get that done? The emotional army, you're sad, you're scared. Those are alarms. Those are thoughts. Those are clouds in the sky that blow away, and they're not you. So you just gotta focus and get the job done. Keep that army strong. So that's, I think, part of the thing that I work on. So that doesn't mean you go crush yourself in the gym for 4 hours and injure yourself. It just means you just do 1% every day. Like, let's build relationships. Let's find that purpose. Let's work on our physical, mental, emotional health and find that security. Because if you're not secure, the alarms go off and you feel these stresses and you try to tampen it with alcohol or whatever you're doing. So I think that security may be financial. It may be people around you. And again, I reiterate, like I went back to the founding fathers and ancestors. So at least we're not going to get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. But the alarms are going off and we're still feeling this. So, and the other point I'd make is it doesn't take much, right? I met these incredible veterans through my charity, The Battle Continues. I'll never forget their story. Brock, Army veteran, tough guy. He's got a new reconstructed back and ankle, and he's just so positive. And his wife, Christina, is a Navy veteran, and they found themselves, like many veterans when they came back, homeless. Because again, like many jobs correlate physician to physician, but many jobs, gunner, tanker, whatever, scout, does not. they found themselves homeless. And I asked them, what can the battle continues? What can people do? What can people do to help someone like you who's homeless? And their answer shocked me. They answered in synchrony. And I was like, what can people do? What's the best gift you received? And they answered simultaneously. The best gift they received when they were homeless was a blanket, a simple blanket. That's all it took. So it's always, we think it takes so much to overcome, to help people, to connect. But these little things, simple blanket, little things really make a difference. And that's kind of what motivates me in my mission is it doesn't take much. It's just 1% every day, little things. And it's the cumulative effect of that. And then you'll have hard times in the middle, but you know how to compartmentalize. You know how to overcome. You know there are clouds in the sky that'll pass. You reach out and then you keep going. And that is the mission. That's the mission of what we went through in the military. That's the mission of how we overcome what we went through. That's the mission of if you've never been in the military and you're going through stress, that's the mission of what drives us and what we're doing every day trying to maintain our families, our health, our loved ones.
I love seeing other veterans getting involved in helping and starting organizations like yours, The Battle Continues, that supports injured veterans. Before we unpack a lot of what you said, would you mind just doing a quick description for our audience of what inspired you to start The Battle Continues and what it does?
Sure. I think, I called it The Battle Continues because when I was in Baghdad or Najaf in August 2004, in one of the most intense moments, or the second battle of Fallujah, at that point, you just want to come home, right? You're just like, let's get through this, let's survive, let's try to keep our limbs and our eyesight, and let's try to go. And there are heroes who weren't able to do that. And when you come back, you realize it's not just utopia when you come back. The battle still continues. You have to reintegrate into a world that's challenging, and the veterans still struggle. So that's why I called it The Battle Continues. It's a 501c3 charity, so anyone who donates, it's a tax deduction. It goes into basically, nonprofits 501c3s work. It goes into a glass fishbowl, so all the money's in there. You can see it. And then I kept it simple. We basically help people with their medical bills. That's what we do. And our board of directors basically tries to help people with their medical bills. Because this is more like a side passion for me. Like I'm still practicing as an emergency physician. I'm still, the medical director out here in West Texas for pre-hospital and running businesses. I'm a professor at University of Illinois and Texas Tech, and I'm keeping busy with that. So what I'm trying to do is just keep it simple where I can still try to help those who need help without getting shot at, which is a lot more pleasant. And then maybe impact, right? Brock and Christina, right? Like just little things you can do to help. And we can all do it, whether it's buying that person who's struggling a simple coffee, saying thank you, whatever that is, giving them a job, however we can help.
Yeah, I'm of the belief that we're going to be able to solve a lot of society's problems if we start seeing society as our community. So those around us, and making these daily impacts that you're talking about, trying to just be that person that people can go to and ask for not always monetary support, but, resources, even just that person that says like actually stops and takes the time to ask, how are you doing today? And letting that person then express what they're feeling. Are there any ways that you feel like individuals, organizations, or society as a whole can help contribute to the veterans' mental and physical well-being, especially more so in this mental health space?
I think combating loneliness, finding that camaraderie, I think we're thinking about this whole thing wrong when we talk about PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. In order to solve this, we have to understand it. And it's not a disorder. Like I said, stress is a normal bodily reaction that helps human beings survive and thrive. We want stress. We need stress. The problem is we can't cope with it now. And I think we're thinking of it all wrong, that, you as a veteran face something traumatic and now you have this entity So number one, we got to drop the D. It's post-traumatic stress, not post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we got to think of it properly, because it doesn't make sense to me that there are veterans who never even saw combat that have this, or it occurs 30 years later in our Vietnam veterans. It just doesn't make sense to me. That's because of something traumatic. So I think instead of taking PTS and pinning it to the soldier and saying, or Marine or sailor or whoever, and saying, you're having this because of a traumatic event, I think we look ourselves in the mirror as a society and we pin it to ourselves. This is a post-traumatic isolation disorder where that soldier comes back and becomes more and more isolated, more and more withdrawn. People don't understand what they've been through. They don't love the activities they used to love doing. And it leads to bad outcomes. So this is where we can help as a society to find that brotherhood, that sisterhood, that camaraderie. Simple thank you to the soldier. In Brock and Christina's situation, a blanket, buying them a coffee, giving them a job, hiring them if you're in the position to do it. However, it's fighting that isolation. That's what society can do. And it helps the person who's doing it too. And I think that's the number one thing. Remember, you want connections that you're intimate with, connections that you can do activities with, and you want also to be a part of a group where you feel like you belong. So a lot of the veterans have veteran groups. They feel like they belong. They can get more involved there. And then finding the other two, fighting that isolation. And, if you look statistically at this, it's not just the military. It's 7% of college students have a suicide plan, 7%. So whether you're a manager, you're a single parent, you're working a job and trying to make ends meet, these issues are real and we have to combat it. Find purpose, find brotherhood, sisterhood, humanhood.
That is an incredible response. Thank you for that. Like, I can see a lot of that in my own life, like that isolation. Obviously, there are other physiological things that do happen until we can learn to manage the isolation, the loneliness, the anxiety, whatever the physiological reaction is. One of the things that I'm currently working on that's been very, very successful is a gradual detox over my life. Alcohol got cut out 13 years ago, reducing the level of medications, increasing the physical well-being. And I know for me, my life is significantly different when I've embraced things that you're talking about, especially the community aspect and being part of a healthy community, not one that's going to continue to drag me down, but one that's going to continue to try to build me up. Unfortunately, there are the ongoing struggles and tragic suicide rates among not just service members, veterans, and first responders, but those out there in society as a whole. As you mentioned, the 7% of college children with a plan. Every time I go and talk to a new group, I find a new group that is also struggling with this. We just happen to be part of a large network that is able to support one another because we're used to that type of camaraderie. We're used to our brothers and sisters being there for us. And I'd love to know from you, what message of hope do you have for somebody that is currently battling? If they walked into your clinic and said, "Hey, Dr. Bose, I'm thinking of ending my own life," what would you say to them?
These are intense moments, and we do have this in the emergency room a lot. Is there a magic word or saying that's not cliche? Maybe not. Number one, I'd say seek help. The emergency room is open 24/7, 365. Seek help. And, I'll just kind of revert to a quick story. You remember this. You were in Afghanistan, Iraq, little different terrain. Like there's palm trees and it's a warm environment. And I remember just palm trees split in half from bombs, rubbles of buildings, just dust everywhere, dirt, ugly terrain. It's horrible. And you're just going through Fallujah, you're going through Baghdad. And I remember I just saw this random, just in the middle of the dust dirt, this random flower. I'm like, how did this get here? This is like the most beautiful flower I've ever seen. Colorful flower in the middle of a combat zone. And I still remember that flower. And we're in a life where we're fighting our wars. Dings, notification, digital connections, global terror, AI, media, home stress, finances, everything, war. But there are flowers in there. And I think the art of living life is building your strength and resilience to get through the war and noticing those flowers, your children, your family, your loved one, whatever those are for you, and appreciating those flowers. So for someone struggling, you're normal. I mean, our ancestors, our founding fathers, these alarms are normal. They lead to fatigue. They lead to irritability. Our brains are always scanning the environment for threats. When we're lonely, our body's recognizing you're by yourself. You're sad. You're going to lose loved ones, as have our fathers and our fathers' fathers and our fathers' fathers. Everybody's been through this. And sometimes you don't have a tribe to spot that danger. And there's your adrenals dumping the cortisol into your body, and your hypothalamus pituitary axis dumping glucocorticoids. And there it goes. And in these situations, don't catastrophize. You're not alone, and to seek help. I think that's what I tell them. And you're tough. I mean, if you're a veteran and what you've been through, you're tough. And if others, generations and generations and generations prior, made it, you can do this. And sometimes you'll need medicine. Sometimes you won't. Sometimes you just need a holding hand, whatever it is, but seek help.
It's beautifully said, Sudip. Thank you so much for those words. Before we end our conversation, I'd love our listeners to know, where can they find and connect with you and your projects?
Sure. I'd love to connect. So I'm Dr. Bose, B-O-S-E. So you can go to docbose.com, docbose.com. From there, you can connect to my social media. Most of those are Dr. Sudip Bose or Doc Bose. I post a lot of medical, how to stay healthy or veteran sort of stuff on social media. So that's the best way to connect, because you don't want to connect with me in the ER. I don't want to see you in the ER. You don't want to see me in the ER. So stay healthy. Thebattlecontinues.org is the nonprofit. Doc Bose will connect all these. There's a website that connects in there in docbose.com. It's called helpforptsd.org. It's a free resource, helpforptsd.org, where you can get some help there. Our healthcare system is broken. It's dysfunctional. It's embarrassing to work in as a physician. I know people are struggling with whatever healthcare system they may be in. But together we can overcome this. So reach out and remember, your body has alarms. It always has. Your ancestors had it. Everyone has it. So just recognize the alarms, recognize what's the fire, try to extinguish it. And hopefully your listeners will set their alarms and go watch Desert Doc on Prime Video. All right. Shameless plug. I'd be honored if you guys did.
That's a great shameless plug. It's about to be something that I binge watch through as much as I can.
It's a quick binge. It's like 25 minutes an episode. It's about 12 episodes. So I think people will gain a lot. It's actually entertaining, and we could end up in the emergency room, any one of us. So we can learn a lot from it too.
Oh yeah.
And there are a lot of veterans in there. Cool. Yeah, it's about 600 total people in the episode. So, even though they use me as the central character to tie the storylines, you're going to see first responders, medics. You might see places you recognize in Iraq for some of your listeners, and all sorts of footage.
That's awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to binging through the series. I hope our listeners go and watch the show, support the work that you're doing. We can all conquer these issues together as a community. So stop isolating yourself, take your headphones off, call a friend, start building your list of 3 people that you can call at any time. And Sudip, I really, really appreciate your time here on the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And for all our listeners out there, thank you if you made it this far through the podcast. And just remember, we're one, right? Just like we were in the military, we're one group, we're one veteran, and hopefully you're staying healthy and you're walking 1 mile.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, also remember you can catch the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast on Reese Across America Radio, ready for you on platforms like iHeartRadio, Odyssey, and the TuneIn app.